Maynooth is well known for its libraries. The modern University Library, named after Pope John Paul II, the venerable Russell Library, designed by the great architect Augustus Pugin. But here on this site was a library that predated them all, the long-lost library of the Earls of Kildare. We're here on the grounds of Maynooth Castle, which was the home and headquarters of the Fitzgerald family, the Earls of Kildare. They came in with the Anglo-Normans in the 12th century with an army that conquered vast swathes of the country. And by the 16th century, they were at the height of their power. Often, the Earl of Kildare was chosen by the Crown of England to rule Ireland on his behalf. A contemporary observer, Richard Stanihurst, who worked as a tutor here to the young Earl, described great tapestries on the walls and the many beds in this place and the rich clothing that was worn by its inhabitants. He describes it as one of the wealthiest of the Earl's houses under the Crown of England. But as well as being a family of great power and wealth, the Fitzgeralds were also a family of culture and learning, and they had interests far beyond these islands. They were in correspondence with Renaissance Florence, the Florence of the Medici family. And they were also great readers and patrons of bardic poetry in the Irish language. This incredibly rich culture of theirs is shown in a really precious survival, one of just 2 library catalogues that survive from medieval Ireland. We have a list here, in fact 2 lists, one dating from 1531, just a few years before the family's downfall, and the other from around the year 1500. Lists of books that were held in the library here in Maynooth Castle. Together, these lists give a fascinating insight into the forces that shaped the intellect and imagination of the Fitzgerald family. The lists are organised by language: Latin, English, French, and Irish. Among the Latin books are several copies of the Bible, as well as sermons by St. Anthony of Padua, and works of philosophy and theology by Dominican friars like Antoninus of Florence and St. Thomas Aquinas. And there's one really precious survival from these Latin books as well. It's now held in the Pierpont Morgan Library in New York. It's a book of hours, a book of personal prayer, and it's incredibly richly illustrated with portraits of the saints and scenes from the life of Christ. But in the margins you have these beautiful little details, handwritten notes announcing the death or the birth of members of the Fitzgerald family. There's ancient Roman literature among the Latin books as well, like the poetry of Virgil and Juvenal and the comedies of Terence. And there's also Latin literature by the great humanists of the Renaissance, people like Thomas More and Lorenzo Valla. Among the French books are works of history and spirituality. There are parts of scripture translated into French. There are lives of the saints written in French. There's works of chivalric poetry by the great woman poet Christine de Pizan. There's translations into French by the great Renaissance poet Petrarch. And there are Arthurian legends too, like Lancelot du Lac. Among the English books are works of religious controversy, books that took the side of Catholics against Protestant arguments. So there's one book written by Henry VIII in his Catholic phase, a defense of the 7 sacraments against Luther. This family was very closely linked to Henry VIII at one point in their career. And there's also a work by Thomas More defending the Catholic practice of pilgrimage. And finally, most fascinating for me, the books in the Irish language. Here we have works in Irish history and genealogy. We have works of native Irish literature about characters like Cuchulainn and the children of Lir. And we have lives of the saints written in Irish, not just about Irish saints like St. Finian, but also foreign saints, St. George and St. Catherine of Alexandria and St. James. But just think about that for a minute. On these shelves, you have stories about Cuchulainn and Lancelot and Aeneas. On these shelves, side by side, you have works of Irish genealogy and theology by Thomas Aquinas and history by Jean Froissart. It's an extraordinarily rich and multicultural collection of books. Very few of these books survive anywhere, just a handful of them in libraries from New York to Oxford. But one of them that survives, an Irish language translation of an important medical work, tells us something about the value of these books, their monetary value. A little note written into it says that this book was bought for the price of 20 head of cattle. A library like this is not assembled by accident. It's the work of generations of wealthy men and women consciously interested in the oldest of stories and the latest of fashions, consciously engaging with the world around them through 4 languages: praying, learning, plotting, and partying with the help of their precious books.